We're going to look at that passage in James chapter 1 in a moment. But before that, we're going to ask three questions. Three questions of the book of James more generally. The first is who? We're going to ask who, what and why. Who? Who wrote the book of James? Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, James wrote the book of James, but which James? You see, chapter 1 verse 1 says, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. But it doesn't tell us which James. There are a few Jameses in the New Testament. One of them was James, the brother of John, who was part of the inner circle, one of the 12, as in Peter, James and John. It's probably not him who wrote the book of James that we're going to be looking at, because he died very early on in the book of Acts. There was another James who was the brother of Jesus, the brother of the Messiah, the half-brother of Jesus, another son that Mary and Joseph had. And that's who has written this book that we have in front of us. This James that we're going to be reading is the half-brother of Jesus. And that's significant for us. It's significant because of what verse 1 says. James says, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. I think if I was the brother of Jesus, the brother of the Messiah, I might be tempted to say, James, or Brian, the brother of Jesus. But he doesn't say that. He says servant. There's no sense of elevation here from James, but one of servant, of service to Jesus. It's significant also because James in the Gospels, when you read about James, he generally opposes Jesus. He was quite sceptical that his older brother might be the Messiah. But his life was changed when he saw the risen Jesus. You can read about that in 1 Corinthians 15. He was no longer a skeptic, but a servant of God and of Jesus. So that's who. Who wrote the book of James? Well, it's a book written by James, the brother of Jesus. What is the book of James? Well, it's a book full of truth, full of applied truth, full of how we ought to live in the nitty-gritty of life. It's a book about how we ought to live out and apply our faith to the daily living that we encounter. It means what it should be a Christian to live in school, to be at home, to be a husband, to be a wife, to be a son, a daughter, a friend, a neighbour. What does it mean to follow Jesus and to live practically in the nitty-gritty of life? That's what the book of James is about. It's about wisdom for everyday living. It's a little bit like the book of Proverbs. If you've ever read the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, that's full of wise sayings. This is a little bit like the New Testament equivalent of that. Wisdom for daily living, real life faith. It has many themes, three main themes, I think, in the book of James. Trial and temptations. That's one of the main themes. Wisdom for practical living. And also how the poor and the rich interact. And we're going to see all of those three themes in our passage as well. But we'll see that time and time again as we look at James. So that's who, what, why. Why are we looking at James? Well, it's part of the Bible. It's part of God's inspired word to us. But it's about trials. It's about testing. It's about hard times. It's about how we ought to live wisely in difficult circumstances. Have you gone through any difficult circumstances in 2020? Do you anticipate any trials, any testing, any hard times in 2021? I do. How we ought to live wisely is important in every generation. Every generation of Christians need to think about how they live wisely. It is especially needed now. What is the wise thing to do in a pandemic? How do we live wisely? The book of James is all about that. That's why we're going to be looking at it over the next 5 weeks. And we're praying as elders that this will be helpful for us, encouraging for us as we think to live out our faith in the midst of difficult times. So that's who, what, and why. We're going to get stuck into those first 12 verses of the book of James. We can look at that first a little bit together now. And there are three commands in this chapter. The first is think rightly. Think rightly. Look down at verse 2. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. James says, in the midst of trials, difficult times, hard times, we are to think rightly. We're to have a right mindset, a right thinking that happens. We're to regard it as pure joy. Now, I don't know about you, when I go through perhaps trials, difficulties, hard days, my thinking is probably the first thing that goes off. It feels like sometimes the days can overwhelm us. Like it's hard to get our thought process right. It's hard to put things into perspective. Do you feel like that? That's why James says, think, consider it to be pure joy when we go through trials. Now, he's not saying that the trials necessarily themselves are good things. They may be very hard things. But he says that we can have pure joy. We're to regard those things as joy, as pure joy or all joy. Now, joy here is not the same thing as happiness. You can be sad and yet joyful, sorrowful yet rejoicing, Paul says somewhere else. That is because happiness is an emotion. Happiness, sadness are emotions that are caused by circumstances that come at us. Joy is a much deeper rooted affection, something deeper rooted in us that is unaffected by just the circumstances we go through. So we can be sad, but also yet rejoicing. And so James here says, when we go through difficulties, we are to think. We're to consider them pure joy. Now, how can he say that? How can that be true? Well, it's because of what he says then in verse 3. Consider it pure joy because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. That's why we can regard it as pure joy. Not that it's necessarily good in and of itself, but because God is at work in the situation. He is at work in us, producing perseverance, producing an endurance, an ability to keep going. In hard times, it may feel like God is absent, like God is not there, like he's not involved somehow. James says that's the total opposite. In trials, in difficult times, God is with us. He comes to us. What is he doing? Well, he may change the circumstance, but he always wants to change our character. That's what God is doing. He's changing our character, producing in us a perseverance, an ability to keep going. The trial, the testing, the difficulty that we may face in 2021 is not futile. 2020 was not a waste of your year. Hours in lockdown, days, weeks, months in lockdown was not wasted. God is producing in us character, producing perseverance. It's not fruitless. God is working fruit, a godly character in us. That's what God is doing, and that's why we can consider it pure joy. And the result of that is verse 4. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete. The result of thinking rightly in our difficulties, the result of allowing God to be at work is that we become mature and complete. Not sinless, of course, but a mature Christian. A wise Christian, a mature Christian. It doesn't happen automatically because we all know that there are two people who go through the same situation and they respond very differently. You can be a Christian and not consider it pure joy, not think rightly, and not allow God to be at work in you. And you won't produce perseverance and have a godly character that is mature and complete. But if we think rightly, if we consider it to be pure joy, if we remember that God is at work and we allow him to be at work and don't resist him, then we will know, James says, that we are complete and mature as Christians. Now let me give you an example. We're talking in theory here. Let me give you an example from this very week. On Monday morning, we began homeschooling. And some of you parents will have had to have done that this week. And some of you children perhaps watching will have been homeschooled this week. And it's not easy. Not easy for the kids, not easy for the parents. We were frantically looking at the various apps we had to be downloading and using, printing off what felt like a rainforest of resources, trying to get the kids to concentrate, trying to get our heads around ourselves what we were meant to be doing. And in addition to that, we had a little toddler who was feeling sorry for himself this week. He was teething. We slept terribly on Sunday night. Monday morning felt chaotic in the Whittaker household. It felt like a trial of some sort. And I knew that once I'd finished the homeschooling that morning, I was going to come into my office here. I was going to sit at my desk just there, and I was going to write a sermon where the passage began, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds, trials of many kids. as may be the case. I knew that that's what I was going to be preaching on, and yet I felt like I was in a trial. So I tried to consider it pure joy. I tried to have a right mindset. I tried to think, well, even though this is hard, the stressful situation here in the house, God is doing something here. He is producing perseverance. He's working in my heart. James says, in the midst of trials, we are to think. The first thing to do is to think rightly. Think rightly. But the second command in this passage is to ask rightly. To think rightly, but also to ask rightly. Now, if you're anything like me, it's all well and good to say, well, of course we ought to consider it pure joy. It's not very easy to do that. And that's why James says what he does in verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God. Now, wisdom, and particularly wisdom in our speech, is a key thing in the book of James. And here he says, if we lack wisdom, particularly in the context of a trial, we are to ask God. Now, this is true as a principle generally. If we lack wisdom, we ought to pray to God to help us. It's particularly here in this context talking about trials, talking about difficulties, things that we go through. If we're struggling to understand what's happening, if we need wisdom in that situation, what are we to do? We're to ask God. Now, wisdom here is not the same thing as intelligence. Wisdom is how we put it into practice, how we live our life wisely, skillfully. There are many people in the world who are intelligent but unwise. But James says we should ask God for wisdom to know how to live. So imagine the scene. Let's be practical. Imagine the scene. In a month's time, we're still in lockdown. We've been homeschooling for a long time. Perhaps even church is closed. Perhaps there are even tighter restrictions than we have now. Perhaps you're lonely, you're frustrated, you're worried, you're anxious, you haven't seen your friends for a while, you haven't seen neighbours. Perhaps some people that you know have gotten poorly. Perhaps you're poorly. Perhaps you're worried. What do you do in that trial, in that difficulty? Well, you remember this passage. You remember to consider it pure joy. Consider it knowing that God is at work somehow, producing in you a perseverance. But I bet that you'll need to ask God for wisdom. You'll need to pray. You'll need to ask God to help you to think like that. On Monday morning, I did not instinctively think, this is pure joy. I'm going to consider this to be pure joy because God is at work. Not many of us are like that. In fact, verse 5, when it says, if any of you lacks wisdom, you ought to ask, it implies that we do lack wisdom. It's basically saying, if any of you lack wisdom, and you will lack wisdom, then you ought to ask. If we're struggling, our instinct is to pray, is to ask God for help. And there's good news. The good news is if we do ask God for help, we have a God who gives generously to all without finding fault. When we ask God, he is a generous God, a kind God. God gives, not begrudgingly. He's not exasperated, he's not frustrated, he's not apathetic or a bit mildly annoyed with us. He's generous. He gives without finding fault or without finding reproach in us. He is kind. He is merciful. When I prayed for help on Monday morning, he didn't think, oh, here's Brian again. What an idiot. Why can't he get his life sorted? He's meant to be preaching on this passage. All he's doing is homeschooling his kids, who are pretty well behaved, really. Can't he sort himself out? Pull yourself together, man. Do you ever think that? Do you ever think, oh, I wish I could just sort myself out, pull myself together, being pathetic here? You may think that about yourself. You may even say that about somebody else. God never says that. He gives generously to all without finding fault. He is a generous God who loves to give generously. And so one application, perhaps even the main application of this passage, maybe in the hard times, in the weeks, the days, the months that are to come, to ask God for help. Don't wait to get your life sorted before you ask God. Come in your brokenness. Come in your frustrations, in your tears. Come in the mess that you've made of your life, the mess that you've made of your day. Come then. He loves to give generously. He gives without finding fault. Come to God and ask for wisdom. He's the giving God who gives wisdom generously. It is of grace, gives it to all, whether you deserve it or not. He loves to give. I hope that's an encouragement. That has been a big encouragement for me this week. He gives generously. We don't deserve it, but he gives it. That's good news. We're to ask, though. We're to ask rightly. So look at verse 6. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt. Because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea blown and tossed by the wind. James here says we're to ask rightly, and that is to ask confidently. To ask with confidence, not doubting. He's not saying you can't have any sort of questions, but not doubting the character of God. If we're following Jesus, if we're a servant of God and of Jesus Christ, we know God's character. We know he's generous. We know he's kind. We may sometimes forget that, but we're not to doubt that. We're to be confident. We're not to be like the sea. The example here is the sea that is always sort of ebbing and flowing, always in flux, never consistent, never constant. But we know, because we have faith in Jesus, that God and his character is always generous. We can be confident, sure, and we're to ask for wisdom with confidence. So we're to think rightly, we're to ask rightly, ask for wisdom, and to do it confidently, knowing God's generous character. And thirdly and finally, we're to boast rightly, Verse 9. Believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position. Now you may think, are we ever to boast? Is there ever a good sense of boasting, of taking pride? Well, there is. Verse 9. It's literally the humble brother or the humble sister, the believers in humble circumstances. That's all of us. The contrast here is verse 9 and 10 between ordinary Christians, sort of humble, Joe Bloggs Christians, us, no disrespect, and the rich, who are the sort of ruling elite, the people who are sort of ruling society. He says, humble Christians, the humble brother or the humble sister, ought to be boasting, ought to take pride in their high position. Now, what does that mean? Well, the high position is their status as a son and daughter of God. We're to rejoice, to boast, to take pride in the fact that we are God's children, us. I mean, look at verse 12. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. The crown of life. We're going to have the crown of life. We can boast, we can rejoice in that hope. Even though we're just ordinary, humble people, we can rejoice in that. We're to boast rightly, boast in what God has done for us in his grace. The contrast, of course, is verse 10. It's the fleeting nature of life. Verse 10, the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wildflower. The sun rises, the scorching heat withers the plant, and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away even when they go about their business. Now, if 2020 has taught us anything, it's that. The fleeting nature of life. It could just be gone like that. None of us will live forever. Makes no difference in the face of a virus whether you're rich, whether you're successful, whether you're famous. Makes no difference. Life is fleeting. One day all of us will die if Jesus hasn't returned. One day even the memory of us will fade away. Just think, for example, whether you know the name of your great-grandfather or your great-great-grandfather. One day all that's left will be a weathered tombstone that no one ever goes to. Well, that's sobering. It's okay though. Why? Because of verse 12. If we're trusting in Jesus, we will have the crown of life. On that day when we die, our souls will go into heaven, to be in Jesus' presence. We will be more alive than we have ever been in this world. We will have the crown of life, life itself, ruling, reigning with God forever. And when Jesus comes back, we're going to be raised physically from where we've been buried, and we're going to go into a new world that is free from anything that's wrong. That is a hope that we have for those who love God, who love the Lord. He will give us the crown of life. That's the hope that we have. That's the hope of a Christian. And that means that whether we go through trials, difficulties, we can have joy. We can consider it pure joy, knowing that God is at work, changing us, caring for us, giving us wisdom, and we can boast in the goodness and the generosity of God. So let's do that now.